Very warm welcome back to you watching France 24. It's time for the second half of our debate now. And it sounds, well, simple, doesn't it? Pro-European parties have won the elections in Ukraine. The people say they want to be part of Europe. So, of course, Ukraine will move towards Europe. Well, that at least is the hope from the party of President Petro Poroshenko and of the Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who's even said the main task is to quickly form a pro-European coalition for carrying out agreements with the EU. The trouble, of course, though, that those pro-Russian residents living in the east and also those living in the south, in Crimea, have not even voted at all. And, of course, watching all the developments from Moscow, a certain Vladimir Putin. Will it let any move towards Europe happen at all? Well, with me to discuss that very, very shortly, I'm going to be joined by Anna Garmisch, who's member of Euromaidan, which began the demonstrations in Ukraine almost a year ago, of course wanting more links with Europe. She's also a member of the Commission, in fact, for the presidential elections. And also with me on set in just a moment is Anton Koslov, who's a Russian-American journalist and associate professor at the American Graduate School of Paris. Both those guests joining me in just a few moments' time. First, though, let's have a report on the latest situation in Ukraine. I'm sorry, we seem to have a problem with that. We'll come back to it a little bit later on if we possibly can. So the latest then that we've had is that the pro-European members have done exceptionally well in these elections in Ukraine. That's been the latest situation. And I'm just waiting for a couple of guests to join me, who hopefully will very, very shortly here on the France 24 debate. And in fact, we're just wheeling a guest in to talk to me now, so I shall talk to him. Good to have you with us. It's Anton Koslov, who's a Russian-American journalist, associate professor at the American Graduate School of Paris. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. Three-quarters of those voting in this election supporting Ukraine becoming more aligned with Europe. I mean, doesn't that settle the country's future now?
Well, I think it's very good that the Ukrainians voted for this pro-European course, but I think it's a very simplistic view to say that people who voted today and who basically favored a number of political groups, that they're going to now enter the EU and the European future is assured. I think it's far more complicated than that. I think the political landscape it's far more diverse and complicated. That I think this kind of cheerleading approach, I mean, why not? But it certainly does not resolve any problems and does not settle any disputes at this point.
So how do you resolve the problems then?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, you really have to look at these elections from the point of view, I mean, how different they are from, let's say, the parliament elections that took place before. I think it is important to keep in mind that the political parties that today will dominate the Ukrainian parliament, they represent in many ways the same oligarchic interests that they represented before. Except, well, we have a number of new political parties, of course, but the oligarchs that finance them are the same. They did not go away. With the exception, of course, of Yanukovych political party, the Party of Regions, which practically does not exist anymore. Nevertheless, there is the opposition bloc, which basically regrouped those who were before in the Party of Regions. So I think it is important to keep in mind that, first of all, these elections are certainly not the victory of Petro Poroshenko. It is a big mistake to consider as his personal victory.
Why do you say that, though? I mean, if he and the other parties that are aligned with him have won three-quarters of the vote, surely that's a victory.
Well, I think aligning is a very sort of big word for that. I think, first of all, he expected to get between 30 and 40%. He got only 22, something like that. Second of all, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk is basically got the same results. So it's going to be a coalition now, with the exception that clearly this coalition, we've seen the same type of coalition before when Yushchenko and Tymoshenko had to coexist. And it did not yield any positive results for the country because after that, after 6 years, both of them were in power. Yanukovych came to power. So I think it is important to keep in mind that all this democratic rhetorics about Ukraine becoming the state of law, democracy, and on and on. It's all very nice. But it does not represent any political reality on the ground at this point.
But I mean, we've already heard today from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk both saying now that the country has voted. They're going to start making moves to align the country more with Europe. Is that not the right thing to do in these circumstances?
Well, I mean, look, the entire Donbass crisis, in many ways related to this, has the attempt to ally Ukraine with Europe and maybe NATO. So I think, first of all, you have to keep in mind, I mean, we're all in favor. I mean, certainly nobody will say that Ukraine should not. Definitely, if they decide to go, why not? Let them go. But you also have to consider that they are important strategic players in the east of Ukraine, and they're watching. That's one thing. And second thing, you also have to keep in mind that Yatsenyuk and Poroshenko, they are not free to decide at will what they want. They certainly represent different interests. Well, Poroshenko is an oligarch himself, but he's not free. Neither is Yatsenyuk, who is not an oligarch. Yatsenyuk is much more allied to the United States, whereas Poroshenko is much more allied to the European Union. And definitely, their interest may diverge very soon. So let us not now become absolutely euphoric about these elections. It's a good thing that they had taken place, even though I'm not at all sure whether it was something to do during this military crisis. But nevertheless.
And you talk about people having different viewpoints and different, if you like, ways that they want to go forward. Of course, the people who have got a real different opinion are those people living in Crimea and those in certain areas of the east who presumably would still rather align much more with Russia. How do you think those people are going to be feeling today?
Well, look, they're going to have their own vote coming very soon. I think it's on the 4th of November, if I'm not mistaken. They're going to elect their own Russia Parliament. Well, I think right now we're having a situation when central and western Ukraine, they basically continue the Ukrainian state, whereas in the east people are, well, they're at this point different views, because some are demanding full independence, others are more moderate and willing to find some kind of solution with the central authorities in Kiev. Nevertheless, I think people do not, I mean, it's been going on a military confrontation there for the past 5 months, if no longer, 6. So I think it's important to keep in mind that things will certainly not go back to, let's say, at least not very soon, pre-February 2014 situation. So.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about Vladimir Putin in just a moment and
sure.
what he may make of this election. But first of all, let's have that report. Tried to bring it to you earlier on. Let's have this report on the latest situation in Ukraine.
A green light for Ukraine's president after pro-Western parties swept the parliamentary elections. Poroshenko will most likely find broad support for his mandate to end the separatist conflict in the east and continue the country's pivot towards Europe and away from Russia. Poroshenko's bloc is neck and neck with the People's Front, the party of his ally, Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. In third place, a new party made up mostly of activists from the Maidan protests. The job of forming a coalition is underway.
I want to underline our formula, and that is that all parties that took part in the Maidan protests should be involved in the creation of the coalition, namely the Freedom Party, the Samopomych Party, the Motherland Party. All of them can join the consultations to form a coalition, and that started this morning.
The opposition bloc, made up of supporters of ousted President Viktor Yanukovych and his party of regions, garnered about 8% of the vote, signaling the demise of parties sympathetic to Russia.
Moscow's influence on the Ukrainian parliament will be lower now. There will be no communists and there will be no direct Russian agents. Nevertheless, some people are hiding their views until the right moment.
Despite the overwhelming support for the president's platform, Poroshenko faces huge challenges ahead. He needs to revive an economy in tatters, quell unrest in the east, and negotiate a new relationship with Russia.
We're also joined now on the France 24 debate by another guest, Anna Garmisch. She's a member of Euromaidan, which of course began those demonstrations in Ukraine almost a year ago now, in fact, isn't it? Obviously wanting more links with Europe. Seems you've got your way, do you think?
The Euromaidan activists are fairly happy with the result of the elections, obviously. However, the movement was a civic society movement, so we're never supporting a particular party or a particular politician. So it means that the pressure that the movement has been exercising on the people in power and the people who wanted to get into the parliament was fairly efficient. However, obviously, this is just the first step. There's a lot of things to do, a lot of reforms that need to be taken, and all this will still has to be done. And this is really complicated. It's just the first step.
How do you reach out now to those people who didn't vote for you? I mean, there are a quarter of the people in the main body of Ukraine who voted elsewhere. Also, of course, you've got the people living in the east of Ukraine and in the south in Crimea, most of whom one assumes would rather be aligning with Russia at this stage.
I think it's way too... it's generalizing. Saying that all those people would like to be with Russia would be generalizing, obviously, because the situation is way more complicated than that. There is no East and West divide as it used to be presented all the time. You don't have to be Russian-speaking to be pro-Russian. You don't have to be ethnically Russian to be pro-Russian. This is not the case at all anymore. And I think that these elections actually did show a pretty big support for European values, even though those regions, specifically Donetsk and Lugansk, that are not Eastern Ukraine in general. Those are just really two, fairly large regions, but really this is just a minority still. And even in those regions, people still could vote a little, obviously. It was very complicated because of the war, but it was still possible. I mean, half of the polling stations were still open. Half were closed, and this is very bad. But half were still open.
What did both of you think? I'd like to ask you both this question. Whether you think the country now is going to be able to govern itself? I mean, on the one hand, you've got Kiev, which has had its elections. On the other hand, as you were mentioning just a few moments ago, you've got the East and the South who are having their own elections. I mean, surely the only way forward for this is going to be a split now?
Well, I don't think we're talking about split. I think, the idea of finding some way of federalizing Ukraine would be probably a good idea. The problem is that certainly Kiev and Poroshenko don't want to hear that, even though once in a while we hear mentioning of that. But clearly, because Lugansk and Donetsk, they're going to have their elections. They're going to, even though the situation is not very stable, that they will not go back under the fold of Kiev in the near future. So what we're going to have is we're going to have a frozen conflict. In many ways, either similar to the situation in Crimea, in Croatia, or Transnistria. So it's a factor of instability, and clearly Russia will keep that because Russia will do everything to prevent Ukraine from entering NATO. And to maintaining that Article 5 of the NATO chart is, once there's a conflict, territorial conflict in the country cannot join NATO. It's precisely the same situation with Georgia.
We'll talk about Russia in just a moment. Let me just ask Anna Garmisch, first of all, split?
I don't think so. Really not so far. There is obviously danger, as you just mentioned, that there will be a situation like Transnistria. However, I don't think a split is foreseeable so far. It's going to depend, obviously, on what Vladimir Putin thinks, what Vladimir Putin does and will do, obviously, on his plans. But I don't think that people in Ukraine so far want this.
OK, so let's talk about Vladimir Putin. Then what do you think his next move is?
I'm afraid, obviously there are first the elections on the 2nd of November, the so-called elections, obviously, because it's hard to call them legitimate elections in those regions, organized by the separatists. We're going to see how that's going to happen. Maybe a scenario just like the Crimean one, like a referendum that took place in Crimea, opened the way for Russia to legitimize what was happening there. Maybe the same kind of thing is going to happen here as well. It will open the way for Vladimir Putin as well, maybe to try to go down south, to try to link Crimea in terms of territory, Crimea to Donetsk and Lugansk regions. It's hard to predict so far.
And what Anton Kozlov was saying,
I think Putin stated a number of times that he is supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So there will be basically after the annexation of Crimea.
He may have said that, but I mean, a lot of people say he hasn't actually done that so far.
Well, no, he doesn't need to annex Donbass region in any way. There is no point strategically, geopolitically, and politically, and economically. They're going to maintain sort of the situation there when they can control more or less. And in fact, if you see what's taking place in Moscow today, again, a more moderate politicians from his immediate circle are managing the conflict now. It's Surkov, in fact, who is in charge of the situation there. And certainly he is much less radical than some of those people who, in fact, were there from the start. And in fact, one reason why there was some kind of ceasefire and the most radical leaders of the resistance left is precisely because Surkov was appointed. So there will be no annexation or invasion of Ukraine unless Ukraine decides to open up its territories for installing NATO military bases, for example. Then Russia will certainly react. But at this point, there will be no. Putin, in fact, if you listen to him, Putin started talking about this possibility of this conflict from 2008 when Ukraine first bid the entry of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it's something that he openly stated. The same thing as he stated when there was Georgia trying to join NATO, and he talked about Abkhazia and Ossetia. So just, if you listen to him, he basically follows on his words. He doesn't say one thing and then does something completely different. I mean, most of the time, particularly when it comes to a situation like the Ukrainian situation.
Anna Gomes, do you agree with that? Do you think Vladimir Putin will take a back seat, if you like, now?
No, I don't think so. I really don't, because Vladimir Putin has said a lot of things so far, and most of them actually he didn't follow his promises. Respecting territorial integrity of Ukraine, precisely that's what he's not doing right now.
He never promised to not to annex Crimea.
Russia did sign the Budapest Agreement in 1994.
That memorandum, it's a very funny thing. Every time I talk about the memorandum, there's not a single time the word guarantee used in the text of that memorandum. Basically, the memorandum asserts that all the parties support the final Helsinki Act, right? Of course. But there's no guarantee. They basically express their willingness to support European security. So it's not a military treaty. It's not in any way some kind of security treaty. So, at this point, it had become completely irrelevant. And anyways, Putin never signed that. So it was signed by...
Yeah, but Russia is a state, and other Russian leaders did sign this.
Yeah, but the rationale behind not respecting it was that there was a coup in Kiev in February, and legally speaking, there was a coup. And therefore, there's no... Yes, of course it was. If you look at from any point of view, the constitution of Ukraine, international law, and so forth, it is a coup.
But even if you describe it as a coup, though, was it not a coup supported by the majority of the population?
It's a coup supported by the majority is still a coup. We're talking about legality, and from the purely legal point of view, it is a coup. So basically, Russians found a way not to, again. Not a single guarantee was given by the Budapest Memorandum. To say that, in fact, Budapest Memorandum, it's a very vague document, in fact. So I think it is important. I believe that he has no reason to annex the eastern part of Ukraine. I mean, Crimea is a totally different story, because Crimea is the home of the Russian naval fleet, and it's of primordial importance for the security of the Russian southern parts. One as Donbass, no.
And Anna Gamosh, I mean, do you think that, as Anton Kozlov says, do you think that they will try and form some or become more involved with NATO now? Because that's obviously what Anton Kozlov is deeply concerned about.
Well, I think they will consider this. They're really considering this. Why? Just because public opinion in Ukraine just a few years ago wasn't that favorable to NATO, to joining NATO. However, right now, things have changed drastically. So
even though people know what Vladimir Putin might do if that were to come about?
Well, yes, because there were sort of threats from Vladimir Putin before, but now there is an open war, clearly. There is one. And you said that, Vladimir Kozlov just said that Putin never invaded Ukraine, which he technically did, because there are Russian troops on Ukrainian territory, so I'm sorry, but that is happening. And people are concerned about their security, and they're looking to protect themselves from what's happening. And this is, to many people, probably the only way to actually make sure that there is some protection there.
So bright day today for Ukraine, do you think?
I think it's a good beginning. I really think it's a good beginning, because obviously the power needs to feel the pressure of civic society, which is happening right now. So I think it's a good first step. Obviously, you cannot have dramatic changes from one day to another, so there is a lot of hope, but you know, there is also a lot of people do really optimism, but however they're very realistic about what can happen soon, what can happen later, and how the country can evolve.
Bright day for Ukraine?
Well, listen, I think it's a good day. The elections took place. In fact, they're going to be recognized by all the parties, including Russia. So I think it is a positive step. Now, whether those promises will be ever realized, you know, good luck on that. But you know, I think, you know, any legal procedure of changing the executive and the legislative is much more positive and better than the armed conflict. So.
Okay. Thank you very much to both of you for coming in. Good to have you both here to discuss the issue and the topics today. Anton Kozlov, Russian-American journalist and associate professor at the American Graduate School of Paris. Thank you very much. And also Anna Garmisch, member of Euromaidan, which of course began those demonstrations in Ukraine almost a year ago. Thank you to both of us. That was the debate here on France 24. Coming up now, it's time for today's Media Watch. Shuffled in beside me. James Creedon's here with Media Watch. You're going to carry on the theme, aren't you? Buzz surrounding that election in Ukraine, James.
That's right. Just a quick look at how some of this has been playing out on social media. We're staying kind of above, not going into the depth of the policy questions, but Darth Vader, Stuart, who really turned out in Kiev to cast his vote. This for the Internet Party. And apparently he has even legally changed his name from Viktor Shevchenko to Darth Vader.
Five years ago, actually, yes.
Right, so he's taking this very seriously. In any case, I quite like Mashable.com's take on it. The force was not with him, Stuart, because in fact he wasn't allowed to vote because he refused to remove his mask, which apparently he's very attached to. Which reminds, well, I mean, in France it would have been the same because you're legally required to not conceal your face in public. In any case, that was one piece of buzz that certainly got a lot of attention. Meanwhile, the NewRepublic.com, a lot of headlines are like this one doing the rounds of social media and online media. Stuart, Ukraine's election wasn't just a win for pro-Europeans, it was a win for democracy itself. This is a London-based, the Legatum institution, saying that, in fact, we're also seeing an east-west gulf widening. That's the point of view being expressed by some. I quite like this one. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, so let's all give a hand to Ukraine, which voted yesterday and did not completely self-destruct. Progress, folks.
Optimistic.
Russia today getting a jibe in any case, saying that even though there is a recognition of the poll, this is despite violations and doubts. I quite liked this statement on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website of Ukraine. A lot of elections this past weekend, and they were referring to the elections in Tunisia. It is important that elections to the parliament and presidential elections to be held in November put an end to Tunisia's political transition period, says the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine. Perhaps not aware that there are some transitions going on Well, I think they are aware. They must be aware. And so, yeah, there's lots of stuff like that online, Stuart. And
mentioned lots of elections, one in Tunisia
as well. Just
social media full of images of ink-stained fingers in celebration of democracy.
Purple power, one person has called it on social media, and you can indeed see a lot of images such as that going across social media, and I suppose it is a sign of a joyful demonstration of casting one's vote in Tunisia.
James, thank you very much.
Thanks,
a lot more from James coming up very shortly. Of course, he'll be back with a longer edition of Media Watch with Tom Burgess-Watson, who's going to be here with the next programme just starting in a couple of minutes' time. Business news and sport as well coming up, so do stay with us here on France 24. Tom, back with you after the break. Stay with us.